Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Just before we get to our interview, we'd like to give a shout out to Mike, who left us a review on Facebook. Mike wrote this: "The Global Missions Podcast has solid, engaging, and extremely relevant content. It's one of the most professional podcasts devoted to global missions." This is a great encouragement to our team. Thanks, Mike, for taking a minute to write for us. But it also helps lend credibility to this program as other people consider whether they're going to listen in. So here's my ask. Would you take a moment and leave us a rating and a brief review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your podcast app? Thanks so much for helping us get the word out. As many of you know, one of our primary goals on this podcast is to provide encouragement, ideas, and resources for missions teams or missions committees. This episode zooms in on some ideas that will serve this purpose really well as we talk to an experienced missions coach about how we can pursue best practices in our missions efforts. Our guest today is Jennifer Lau, who serves as the Associate Executive Director of Canadian Baptist Ministries. Wow, Jennifer, that is quite a title.
Yes, it is.
Does it fit on one business card? It's really long.
It is a long business. Yes, a very long title. It just means I do whatever my boss tells me to do.
Sure, yeah. Jennifer serves by providing marketing direction. She oversees operations, and she's the managing editor of the CBM magazine Mosaic. All of this on top of being a wife and mother of 2 kids. Jennifer has traveled extensively and is passionate about helping people situate their faith journeys within the global community and encouraging them to faithfully follow Jesus in the world. Jennifer, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Just as we start, would you share a little bit about this organization, CBM, or Canadian Baptist Ministries?
Sure. We're a global mission organization. We've been around for about 150 years. We predominantly work with Canadian Baptist churches, helping to facilitate their mission concerns. But of course, we also work with many other churches from other denominations as well as their mission partner. Globally, we work in about 13 core fields, mostly in Latin America, Asia, and Africa.
And when you talk about walking alongside people, or especially walking alongside local churches, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think for us, we truly want to help a church discover what it means to engage meaningfully in mission. So we don't subscribe to the kind of one-size-fits-all program where we ask churches to buy into it or not. We usually take time to build a relationship with church leadership so that we can help them to discern where God is leading them. Because there's just so many needs in the world that no church can address all of them. So we usually try to help the church figure out what is most meaningful to the church. So it's kind of a relationship that we built together.
Mm-hmm. And could you compare it to consulting of sorts? You're coming alongside to help a church discern what their particular part is?
Yeah, I guess I've never thought of it like that, but I guess that would be probably an accurate description. I'd like to think of it as a discovery process, because often the church has places where God is leading the church, and often they don't know what questions to ask, or they don't know how to figure that out. And so I feel like we're just that kind of outside voice that gives a different perspective.
Very good. Well, this is going to be a really helpful episode if you happen to be serving in a local church. Many of our listeners are, Jennifer. It's a real focus. We want to serve churches with ideas and encouragement and resources. So this is going to be right in the strike zone. Today with Jennifer, we're going to talk about 4 best practices that you can consider for your church, whether you're a pastor or missions committee or someone worshiping in a local body. We'll jump right in. Jennifer, what's the first best practice you'll share with us?
We have a tool that we use called Discover, and in that tool, we think the most important step is figuring out what is the heart of your church. And that's probably the most difficult practice to figure out, because it takes a little bit of digging and it takes a little bit of excavation, I would say, of clearing out some of the stuff from the past as well. So I would say the first thing is just being strategic, like thinking strategically around mission engagement, because often we think that if we use that word, it means like we're not allowing the Holy Spirit to work in our church or something like that. But I actually disagree with that. I think, our God is strategic as well. If you look at the way that he works in our world, that it's actually good to take the time and do your due diligence to figure out what the heart of your church actually is, like where the vision and the passions of your church are.
So the best practice is align with the heart of your church. As the missions team or missions committee wants to do that, what are some of the steps they can take to actually discover, as you've said, or align with the heart of the church?
Well, a good starting point would be figuring out what the vision and direction of the entire congregation is overall. So sometimes mission activity is seen as this periphery activity to the core activity of the church. And often you will see that mission is usually just tasked to a group of people. So usually a mission committee or a mission team, and it's tasked to them to kind of figure out what they're supposed to be doing in mission. This is a huge responsibility. And often it's just so standalone. There's no correlation to what the pastors or the elder board, what they're doing or the direction that they see the church going in or the vision they've set for the whole congregation. And so that to me would be one of the best starting points, is to figure out what is actually the vision of our church overall, and then how does the mission activity fit into that.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is something that I have seen in churches across North America, and it comes from both sides, actually. The missions committee feels some disconnect with the church, but also church leadership or pastors feel some disconnect with the missions committee at times as well. And that's why I really like your word alignment, that they're going in the same direction. They're mutually understood. Practically, what does this look like? What do you suggest for how does a missions committee go about understanding the values and vision? I know they can read it, probably. They can find some documents, right?
Well, usually, most people, if you ask most people in a congregation, they wouldn't have any idea where they would actually even find that information, other than maybe on the church website. I don't know how many of us actually look at our church's website, but I don't think I've ever looked at my church's website. But I guess asking the question, where's your church's heart for people, is probably a very good place to begin. And, sometimes people can answer that much easier when it's local. So things that are happening in our neighborhoods, in our own communities, usually congregations can very quickly get very passionate about helping out in that area because they can identify that need very quickly. I think it's a bit more challenging when you're talking on a global scale. So I think that's why some churches and pastors tend to give that over to a mission team to kind of do that work to figure out, because it is a lot of work to figure out where the church can make the most impact globally. But to me, one of the things is we have to involve the pastor in this process. I think on a very practical level, if the pastor is not engaged in the mission work, there really isn't value to keep doing this kind of alignment process, right? Because if you don't have the church leadership engaged, it's really not going to fly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great observation. We've seen that, and we've tried to speak to this in other episodes this season as well. If you're a pastor and listening, we want to speak with careful respect, realizing that our pastors are really, they're not only busy, although I want to mention busyness because our world is so complex. We just want to acknowledge that. And we want to speak with careful honor and care about the pastoral office, but just to affirm how very important the role and support of the pastor is, or pastors, in any initiative of the church, but particularly when it comes to mission. So the first best practice then is to align with the heart of the church. What is the second best practice you recommend?
Well, just having buy-in from the whole congregation. So you need the whole congregation to be part of the process. Again, it's trying to take mission activity out of the periphery and bringing it back into the core. And if we don't actually engage the whole congregation in this whole process, I think you just run the risk that all it becomes is a list of things on a mission budget. because no one knows how those things got there. No one knows why you're doing those things. No one knows how to get those things off, frankly, most of the time, because, those questions have never been explained to anyone. The process has not been explained to anyone. So engaging the whole congregation is, I think, very essential to any mission activity that a church wants to undergo. And that does involve the pastor, because the pastor needs to not only to look at kind of the recommendations, but also to give airtime during a worship service and space in bulletin announcements and email announcements and all that kind of thing. It's really the pastor who usually is the guardian of that kind of stuff. And so the pastor needs to be able to make space for that to happen, for things to be communicated out.
Well, there again, we come to the pastor's office and church leadership, and how important that would be. If I can imagine a missions committee, well-intentioned, trying to engage the congregation, but if the team hasn't engaged the pastor, there could be some serious misunderstanding, danger even, and frustration. I wonder if you just go a little more practical with us too, what advice you have. Let's assume that the pastor's on board and he's supportive. What are some of the practical means that a missions committee or a missions team could use to help engage the congregation, help them understand that vision?
Well, I think, you can involve a good number of people to do different tasks. So if, say, the church wants to undergo an assessment of needs in the neighborhood, well, that's something you could have a fair number of people in your congregation actually take part in. And actually you want, a wide set of people to be involved in that, because you'll get people who have quite a lot of expertise or insight through their own work or their volunteer commitments. And so I think that's something that's very tangible. It's something that it's time limited. So you're not asking for a long-term commitment. You're just helping us to do this one task. And this one task is going to fit into this whole process in this way. I think that way you're actually getting some buy-in from people because they're involved in it in some small way. And they're understanding that it's feeding into a bigger process. I would say another thing is probably just the messaging. So sometimes you want to communicate stuff to congregations and it's very detailed. So pastors are probably groaning when they allow certain people to make announcements because it's very detailed or it's very technical. I think just, working with your pastor to help simplifying messaging that you're going to give on a Sunday morning. If the pastor allows you to have 5 minutes to share what's happening, then know how to use those 5 minutes well.
You mentioned the worship service as being a principal idea. So there's this idea of doing an announcement, having someone stand there and speak, which sounds very promising. Any other angles on this, ideas when the community is together, when the congregation is together?
Mm-hmm. There's a church that we've worked with that I love the idea that they commit one Sunday a quarter to mission. And it takes many different forms. So it's not just a 5-minute announcement on a Sunday once a month, which is usually what I see most of the time, which is a lovely idea. But I think having something activity related once a quarter, I think it drives home the message in a very different way. So they're very creative in the things that they do, but it's always something that involves the whole congregation. It could be a lunch. It could be having a special speaker come in. It can be, they have one Sunday that's just focused on justice. There's just a variety of ways they do it. And it really engages the congregation. Like it becomes something that they look forward to and is something that is part of who they are as a congregation.
It's really good. Just to throw out some other quick ideas, some churches now are using their slides prior to the service beginning for announcements. And we've seen some churches really effectively feature some of their global workers and local as well. But that's a way of trickling those ideas out there as people sit sometimes thoughtfully, even prayerfully, as the service begins. The other that I'll put out is social media and using the Facebook groups that some churches have established to trickle these ideas out and make them a natural, expected, regular part of the communications going out from the church. Again, want to really make sure it's in collaboration with the church and that the pastor or whoever else understands, and these are not rogue posts, right?
Yes. And we facilitated some Skype calls. So we've had, say, if your church is supporting missionaries working in another country, we've facilitated, depending on the time change, live Skype-ins from the missionaries so that they can just give a brief update or they can actually take part in the service. So we've had missionaries who have done that and read the scripture for the service or played another part in the service. So that's something you can do. And of course, you can always pre-record that segment as well if the time change won't work.
Really good idea. Use the media, use the technology we have. Okay, so 2 best practices. Number 1, align with the heart of the church. Number 2, get buy-in from the whole congregation. What's the third best practice you have today?
And I think I mentioned this before, but assessing the needs. And so I think you have to do that on kind of 3 levels. There might be even more than that, but at least you'd have to do it locally. You'd then have to do nationally and then probably globally. Because, the needs, unfortunately, the needs of our world are so great that there's no way a church can meet all of those. And so what often tends to happen is that someone will send in a request, or somebody in the church will say, oh, I know somebody who, is involved with this. Can the church support this? And that usually ends up being on the mission budget somehow, instead of actually looking at needs on a bigger scale and saying, you know what, our church really feels called to meet this particular need or these 2 particular needs. This is where we feel as though we can really make a deep impact. Instead of kind of having little touch points, we can have a much larger impact. And so I think doing the hard work around assessing the needs within those 3 places is, I think, really, really key.
I want to ask you about the tools that we can use to do that, but I just see these 3 practices, best practices, really not being sequential. I wonder if you agree. Like, to assess the needs and to get buy-in from the congregation. If you don't know yet what the needs are clearly, then getting buy-in into what and what is it aligned with. So these really happen concurrently, right?
Yes, definitely concurrently.
Let's talk a little bit about tools. How do these assessments take place? What do you recommend if a missions committee says, yes, we'd like to get our heads and our heart and our minds around the needs and get it manageable for our church? What can they use for an assessment?
Well, we have a tool that's it's called Discover, and it's a resource which you can actually find on our website, cbmn.org. And it's just a little book. It's broken up into 4 parts, and part of it is helping you work through the needs assessment. And it also allows you to do an assessment of everything that you're currently doing. And that includes volunteer time. So not just the things you're helping to fund or helping to give to, but also the time people put in, because that's all part of your mission engagement as well. So volunteer time and the time the mission committee spends and all that kind of stuff is taken into account as well.
Okay. Now, is that a tool that would be used by the pastor and the pastoral team or by the missions committee? Who would use this tool?
So you really need a team that has been brought together, I think, comprised of people, the right kind of composition of the kind of skills you will need for a team to drive this process forward. So it could be people from your mission committee. It could have your pastor on it. I would always recommend having the pastor on it, but sometimes the pastor isn't able to do that because of time. But you kind of need people that have different skill set and perspective, I think, to be able to do this. Because often the kind of people that serve on mission committees, they're the converted. Like they love mission. We love those people. They are your champions in every church. But you sometimes need people with just a different perspective on it, I think. And so maybe there's people that are just really engaged locally, and that's all they do is volunteer work locally, and they've never done any kind of engagement with global stuff. Maybe you want to have that kind of person on the committee as well. And then you want somebody who can help you do kind of the communication part of it. So somebody who has skills in that. So you really need to have a well-rounded team, I think, to help lead that process and champion it.
Now, this is something, let's say a committee decides to use this tool and work on it. When you've worked with churches before, how long does it take to go through this tool and to come up with your assessment? Is this a 2-week process or 2 months or 2 years?
Usually, yeah, it's long. Usually we say 6 months to a year. Just realizing that, everybody that's doing this, they're volunteers, right? Except if the pastor's on the team as well. But you really don't. Usually in a larger church, it's not going to be the pastor that's really driving it forward. You're working with volunteers. And so being realistic with their time, it's probably at least a 6-month process. Most of the churches who have done this with us have taken about 8 months to a year.
Well, there's a good estimate for you then, if this sounds like a helpful process for your church. Our regular listeners know this already, but we include all the resources that Jennifer mentions in the show notes. So we'll put a couple of links to the website, the CBM website there, so you can easily find this tool. But what's the name of it again, Jennifer?
It's called Discover.
Discover. I also here just want to mention a couple other podcast episodes. Way back in season 1, episode 12 with Ellen Livengood was entitled How to Create a Mission Strategy for a Local Church. And then episode 91 with Pastor Doug Christgau was balancing local and global mission priorities. Important for a congregation to consider, how do we do both local and global missions? Those may be helpful episodes to go along with this. In just a moment, we're going to ask Jennifer to share that fourth and final best practice, as well as some resources. Before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
InnerServe is a community of men and women using our professional skills to do kingdom work in Asia and the Arab world. We believe God has given each of us interests, skills, and talents. We believe He has led us into programs of study, fields of education, and career paths so that we can use our vocations to live a holistic ministry among the least reached people. We aim to see lives and communities transformed by encounter with Jesus. To learn how you can get involved, visit innerservecanada.org today. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we are back with Jennifer Lau, the Associate Executive Director of Canadian Baptist Ministries. I got it all out again. We've been talking about the best practices you can consider for a missions committee, and we've talked about the first three: aligning with the heart of the church. Number 2, getting buy-in from the entire congregation. And number 3, conduct an assessment of the needs of the church. Jennifer, what's the fourth best practice you'll share with us today?
So the fourth one would be to engage the younger generation. And I think we all know how important it is. And I'm very passionate about this, that we have to engage younger people in everything we do as a church. And that definitely extends to mission engagement as well.
And here, let's dive into some of the examples that you have in mind. What are some of the ways that we can invite the younger generation, whatever that is defined as? I'd be glad for you to speak into that too. But what are some of the practical ways we can engage youth in our churches?
Yeah, it's interesting to define what youth is, because globally, it's not defined the way that we do. So often our partners will say youth are people under 35. We would probably think people under 18, but I would say, people under 35, because you definitely see the generational gap when you see who usually comprises mission committees and mission trips, right? You see that it's difficult to usually recruit people that are below that kind of 40-year-old mark. And so I would say we have to be creative in the ways that we do that, because I've often go to churches and I'll hear someone say, well, I've tried to ask this young person to join the mission committee, but they don't want to commit to that. And I say, well, maybe you ask them for something different. So for me, like the people that I've seen that are most passionate about global issues are people that were on mission trips. So like on a youth trip or something like that when they come back, there's this passion, and often we don't know what to do with that passion. So, we need to help them to work through what that's going to look like when they come home, because I actually think you will have a lifelong champion of mission there if we know how to disciple those people afterward and to engage them in something deeper. So something practical, I think, would be even just like you mentioned earlier, slides that churches are doing or social media. Let's have a young person doing those things, right? And you often will find, like I have asked lots of young people before to help me with that kind of stuff. They're very willing to do it. It's not a long-term commitment. It's something they can do pretty quickly and they know how to do it well. It's in their comfort zone, right? So something like that. It's very task-oriented. Maybe having a justice evening, like we talked about before, that church I've been working with, they're looking to run a hunger banquet, which is a resource that I think was created by Oxfam. But that's something that you could task to a youth group to do, right? To put that together. And maybe the mission committee could actually work with the youth group to put that together, right? So now you're building a relationship there. We also have a game, which is a really fun way to do it, which kind of educates young people about global economic disparity. It's called Wealth of Nations. You could find that on our website as well. And that's just a really fun way that the youth group can talk about some of these global issues that some of our mission engagement is trying to address. So those are just a few, I think, examples of ways you could have younger people involved.
Sure. Some helpful ideas there. And here I do want to mention another resource. We'll include this all in the show notes, something called the Go Journal, which is a tool that can be used for short-term initiatives. It doesn't have to be young people. It can be anyone participating in a short-term initiative, but really helps prepare lots of reflection and thoughtful observation during the mission trip or whatever that initiative looks like, and then real attention to that debriefing and cultivation of discipleship following the mission initiative. So that's gojournal.org. We'll put that in the show notes as well. I wonder, Jennifer, if you have other resources that you would recommend to the missions committee that would be useful as they engage all of this.
Well, there's a book that is quite widely read, and I think you've actually featured it on your show before, When Helping Hurts. That's to me, is the most essential reading for every mission committee. And so we recommend that for every single team or mission committee that we work with. And they also have these small group videos from Chalmers Institute that go with it that are great as well. So that's a really great resource. There's also, like, if mission committees want to actually do some reading around kind of the theological part of it, the missiology, we usually would recommend Chris Wright's book, The Mission of God's People, as well as Renee Padilla's Mission Between the Times, which I think is used for the Micah Network. So those would be two that we would say, if you really want to go deeper in kind of the theological part of it, those would be really good starting point references. There's a little book, I have to say, there's a little slim book that three of my colleagues wrote. It's called Going Global. It's by Gary Nelson, Terry Smith, and Gordon King. They're all brilliant people. So it's a very short read, and it's a really good little book, and it just gives you lots of examples of how churches are engaging in mission.
Well, something that's written by brilliant people and short has got to be a good recommendation, right?
That's right.
I do have that book from Dr. Nelson, particularly. Some great suggestions there. You'll find it all in the show notes. Here, I do want to mention again another couple of episodes. Episode 92 with Jolene Erlocker, a great episode, 3 strategies for engaging the next generation in missions. And then Frank Vandermeulen, also from Ontario, Canada, a Canadian gentleman, how local churches can encourage young people in missions, all related to this 4th essential best practice, engage the younger generation. Well, Jennifer, I want to thank you for these best practices. I wonder whether, just as we think about churches, you've got experience across a denomination, I know, and even more broadly than the denomination, but I wonder whether you could share with us a story of a church where you've seen them really get their heart and minds around these best practices.
Sure. There's a number of churches that have really found it to be transformative to do this. But there was one church I remember, particularly in Western Canada, and they undertook this process. It took them about 9 months. And then out of it, they realized that their congregation really had a heart for reaching Indigenous people. And yet, when they did the assessment, they realized they had no budget or volunteers committed to that, even though their heart was there. And so out of that, they realized that they were overcommitted in other things they were already doing. And it allowed them to then make the decisions to scale back on those things and then use the funds to build new relationships. And coming out of that, they actually began to build a relationship with the reserve that was in their community, which, they've been so grateful for that. And as well, on the global scale, they decided that they were going to focus all of their mission engagement in one country in Latin America where they were really feeling called to. So I just remember kind of the gratitude that team expressed for us walking alongside them in that process. And they really felt like they found the alignment after going through it.
It sounds to me, too, like you help them sort of right-size their missions vision for the congregation.
We've worked with churches that have, up to sometimes, depending on the size of the church, between 30 and 50 things on their mission budget, which is a lot of budget items, and usually very small. And so when you ask the question, how did those things get on there? Most of the people have no idea. And so that's when you realize, when you do the assessment, we're really deeply committed. We're just overcommitted in some things that we no longer understand the value of.
Yeah, we want to acknowledge these things may be well-intentioned. And this healthy process would lift the intentionality together to be focused, to be effective and fruitful. Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you, Jennifer. If people would like to reach out to you and maybe follow up if they've got a question, maybe even about the resources you've mentioned, how could they reach out to you?
Well, you can go on CBM's website, so cbmin.org, and you can also follow our social media feeds as well. So most of our current information is usually on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And actually, if you want to reach out to me personally, you can find me in the CBM website under the staff directory.
Okay. Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for spending this time with us today and for sharing these best practices. May the Lord bless you as you encourage and build up churches through your ministry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Max. It was great.
Well, I appreciated this conversation with Jennifer, a fellow Canadian in this case. There are several resources she mentioned that we invite you to check out. Links, of course, are in the show notes. If you have any further questions, you can follow up with Jennifer or with our team. You can write to us at info@globalmissionspodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the team, thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us in 2 weeks when we'll continue to pursue this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.